The ancient radiator in courtroom 4D clanked and hissed, but the sound barely registered above the suffocating silence that had settled over the Denver Family Justice Center like a heavy blanket. 3-year-old Emma Torres sat perched on the edge of the witness chair, her tiny frame dwarfed by the massive leather seat that had been designed for adults. Her scuffed pink sneakers dangled a foot above the floor, swinging slightly with an unconscious, nervous rhythm that broke Judge's heart into 1,000 pieces. Emma's fingers were locked in a death grip around Mr., a threadbare stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The toy's left ear hung by a single thread, and its button eyes were mismatched, one blue, one black from years of loving repairs. The little girl's knuckles had turned white from the pressure of her grip, and her small hands trembled visibly despite her obvious efforts to remain still. Judge had been on the bench for 17 years. She had presided over thousands of cases, divorces that turned ugly, custody battles that families forever, and domestic violence cases that revealed the darkest corners of human nature. She thought she had seen everything. She thought she had developed the thick skin necessary to maintain judicial objectivity while still retaining her humanity. But nothing in her nearly 2 decades of experience had prepared her for the sight of this terrified child, frozen in fear, unable to speak about the horrors she had witnessed. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds, the rustling of papers, the quiet conversations between attorneys, the soft clicking of the court reporter's machine, had all ceased. Every eye in the room was fixed on Emma, whose curls hung limply around her pale, tear-streaked face. Her enormous blue eyes, rimmed with red from crying, darted frantically around the room like those of a trapped animal searching desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. Assistant District Attorney Michael sat at the prosecution table, his usually confident posture replaced by visible anxiety. He had prepared meticulously for this case, spending weeks with Emma and her mother, building what he thought was enough trust to help the child through this ordeal. But now, watching Emma's complete shutdown, he felt his carefully constructed case crumbling before it had even truly begun. On the other side of the aisle, defense attorney tried to maintain a neutral expression, but Judge caught the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smirk, but close enough to make her blood boil. Represented Robert Torres, Emma's father, who sat beside him in an ill-fitting suit, his face a mask of false concern. The man had a record of domestic violence spanning 3 states, but this was the first time there had been a witness. Without Emma's testimony, the physical evidence alone might not be enough for a conviction. Emma's mother, Diana Torres, sat in the front row of the gallery, her own face bearing the fatting yellow-green bruises of assault. Her left arm was still in a sling from where Robert had dislocated her shoulder during his attack. Diana's eyes never left her daughter, and silent tears streamed down her cheeks as she watched Emma struggle. She mouthed words of encouragement that Emma couldn't see. Her free hand pressed against her heart, as if she could somehow transfer her strength to her traumatized child through sheer force of will. Dr. Lisa Hammond, the court-appointed child psychologist, sat beside the witness stand in a chair she had positioned at Emma's eye level. Dr. Hammond had 20 years of experience working with traumatized children, and she had used every technique in her considerable arsenal over the past hour. She had tried gentle questions, starting with easy topics like Emma's favorite color and her stuffed rabbit's name. She had tried silence, giving Emma space to speak when ready. She had tried showing Emma pictures to point at instead of speaking. Nothing had worked. "Emma, sweetheart," Dr. Hammond tried again, her voice barely above a whisper, carefully modulated to be as non-threatening as possible. "Can you tell me about your rabbit? What's his name?" Emma's lower lip trembled more violently. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, the beginning signs of a panic attack that Dr. Hammond recognized immediately. The little girl's eyes filled with fresh tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks, but she made no sound. Not a word, not a cry, just silent tears and that awful, desperate grip on Mr. Judge leaned forward slightly, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. At 62, had earned a reputation as one of the toughest judges in Colorado's family court system. Defense attorneys called her the dragon behind her back, not because she was unfair, but because she suffered no fools and had zero tolerance for lawyers who weren't prepared or who tried to manipulate her courtroom. But that tough exterior hid a grandmother's heart. She had 5 of her own, ranging in age from 6 months to 12 years, and the sight of Emma's terror struck something deep and primal within her. The judge's mind raced through her options. She could call another recess, but they had already taken 2 breaks that morning, and Emma's condition hadn't improved. She could postpone the testimony until another day, but Dr. Hammond had advised against it. Each postponement would only increase Emma's anxiety and reinforce her trauma. The child needed to get through this, to speak her truth and begin the long process of healing. But how could they help her find her voice? Time seemed to slow down as Judge studied every detail of the scene before her. She noticed how Emma's chest rose and fell too quickly, how her feet had stopped swinging and now hung completely still, how her gaze had become fixed on a spot on the floor as if she were trying to disappear into herself completely. This wasn't just fear. This was a child completely dissociating from reality as a psychological defense mechanism against overwhelming trauma. The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence. 10:30 in the morning. They had been at this since 9 o'clock, and they had made exactly 0 progress. Judge felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on her shoulders. She had a duty to the law, to the pursuit of justice, to ensuring that dangerous individuals were held accountable for their actions. But she also had a duty to protect this child, to ensure that the process of seeking justice didn't cause even more trauma than Emma had already endured. Michael rose slowly to his feet. "Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice tight with emotion, "may I approach the bench?" Judge nodded, and both made their way forward, their footsteps echoing in the silent courtroom. They huddled close, speaking in whispers that wouldn't carry to the gallery or be picked up by the recording equipment. "Your Honor," began, his words coming fast and urgent, "I have an unusual request, and I need you to hear me out before you make a decision." Judge's eyes narrowed slightly. In her experience, unusual requests from prosecutors rarely led anywhere productive, but she gestured for him to continue. "The Denver Police Department's K-9 unit has a specialized program," explained, his eyes flicking briefly back to Emma before returning to the judge. "They have therapy dogs, not drug dogs or patrol dogs, but specially trained animals that work with traumatized witnesses, particularly children. I've been in contact with Officer Sarah Mitchell from the unit. She has a golden retriever named Duke who has worked successfully with over 50 child witnesses in the past 2 years." Before could continue, interrupted with a harsh whisper. "Absolutely not. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to manipulate the proceedings and prejudice any potential jury, bringing a cute dog into the courtroom. The defense objects in the strongest possible terms." "There won't be a jury present," shot back. "Duke would stay out of sight of any jury pool. This is about giving that traumatized little girl a chance to feel safe enough to tell the truth about what happened to her mother." Judge held up one hand, silencing both attorneys. Her eyes drifted back to Emma, who had begun to rock slightly in the chair, still clutching Mr., still silent, still trapped in her own private nightmare. The judge thought about her own granddaughter, Lily, who was exactly Emma's age. What would she want someone to do if Lily were in Emma's position? The answer came immediately and with crystal clarity. "Bring in the dog," Judge said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Mister, your objection is noted for the record, but this is my courtroom, and I will do whatever is necessary to help this child testify safely. We will proceed with strict protocols to ensure the integrity of the proceedings, or we won't proceed at all. This child deserves every possible chance to be heard and to receive justice. Make the call, mister." As the prosecutor hurried from the courtroom to contact Officer Mitchell, Judge looked once more at Emma Torres, and she made herself a silent promise. Whatever happened next, she would not let this child's suffering be in vain. The law existed to protect the innocent, and there was no one more innocent than the frightened little girl sitting in her courtroom, waiting for someone to help her find her voice. The wheels of justice, Judge decided, were about to turn in a very unexpected direction. The tension in courtroom 4D had somehow managed to thicken even further during the 15-minute recess Judge had called. Assistant District Attorney Michael paced in the narrow hallway outside, his phone pressed tightly against his ear, speaking in urgent, hushed tones with Officer Sarah Mitchell from the Denver Police K-9 unit. Inside the courtroom, Emma Torres remained in her mother's arms, still silent, still clutching Mr., her small body occasionally shuddering with the aftershocks of suppressed sobs. Judge stood at her chamber window, looking out over downtown Denver's sprawling skyline without really seeing it. Her mind was racing through the potential implications of what she was about to allow. In 17 years on the bench, she had built a reputation for being innovative but never reckless, compassionate but never at the expense of legal propriety. What she was considering now felt like walking a tightrope suspended over a canyon. One misstep could invalidate the entire proceeding and let a violent offender walk free. Her clerk knocked softly and entered carrying a steaming cup of chamomile tea, had worked with Judge for over a decade and could read her boss's moods like a meteorologist reading weather patterns. "I pulled some research for you," said quietly, setting down a thin folder alongside the tea. "Courthouse facility dogs. There's more precedent than you might think." Judge opened the folder eagerly, scanning the contents. Her eyebrows rose as she read. The practice had begun in Seattle in 2003 with a golden retriever named. Since then, over 250 courthouse facility dogs had been placed in courtrooms across the United States. The research showed remarkable results. Children who with a facility dog present showed significantly lower stress indicators, were able to provide more detailed and coherent testimony, and experienced less long-term trauma from the court process. Several appellate courts had upheld the practice, ruling that the presence of a support dog was no different than allowing a child to hold a stuffed animal or have a support person present. "You're a godsend," Judge murmured, her confidence in her decision solidifying with each page she read. "I know," replied with a slight smile. "That's why you keep me around. They're ready whenever you are." Judge drained the tea in 3 quick gulps, squared her shoulders, and walked back into the courtroom with the folder tucked under her arm. The gallery had filled during the recess. Word had spread through the courthouse that something unusual was happening in courtroom 4D, and several other judges and court staff had slipped in to observe. Diana Torres sat in the front row, Emma now asleep against her shoulder, exhausted from the emotional ordeal of the morning. "All rise," announced, and the courtroom came to order. Judge settled into her chair and surveyed the room with the commanding presence that had earned her the nickname the Dragon. The defense attorney sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a stubborn line. Robert Torres whispered something to him urgently, his face flushed red with anger. Michael stood at the prosecution table, his expression a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Before we resume," Judge began, her voice clear and authoritative, "I want to address the unusual measure we are about to undertake. Mr. has requested that we allow a trained therapy dog into this courtroom to provide support for the child witness. I have reviewed relevant case law and research on this practice during our recess." She held up the folder had prepared. "This court finds that the use of a certified courthouse facility dog is a reasonable accommodation for a traumatized child witness and does not prejudice the proceedings." Shot to his feet so quickly his chair squeaked against the floor. "Your Honor, the defense must object in the strongest possible terms. This is highly irregular and—" "Mr. Judge interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Everything about this case is irregular. We have a 3-year-old witness to a violent felony assault. That alone is extraordinary. The question before this court is not whether we will take extraordinary measures, but rather what extraordinary measures are appropriate and legally sound to help this child provide testimony while protecting her psychological. His face reddened. Your Honor, the presence of a sympathetic animal will absolutely prejudice any jury's perception of. There is no jury present, mister, as you well know. This is a preliminary hearing to determine if there is sufficient evidence to bind your client over for trial. Any jury at a future trial will not be present during the child's testimony with the facility dog. Judge's eyes narrowed. Furthermore, I find it interesting that you're more concerned about the optics of a therapy dog than you are about the very real trauma of a 3-year-old child who witnessed your client allegedly beating her mother unconscious. The word allegedly carried the full weight of Judge's skepticism. She had reviewed the police reports, the hospital records, and the photographs of Diana Torres' injuries. The only question in her mind was not whether Robert Torres had committed the assault, but whether they could prove it in court. Your objection is noted for the record, Judge continued, her tone brooking no argument. However, this court has wide discretion in determining appropriate accommodations for witnesses, particularly child witnesses. I have reviewed the qualifications of Officer Sarah Mitchell and the therapy dog, Duke. The dog has received over 500 hours of specialized training through the Courthouse Dogs Foundation and has successfully assisted in over 50 cases across 3 states. Officer Mitchell has 15 years of experience with the Denver Police K-9 unit and has received specialized certification in working with traumatized witnesses. Stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may address the court's concerns about prejudice. Officer Mitchell has explained that Duke is trained to remain completely calm and unobtrusive during proceedings. He will be positioned beside the witness stand, out of direct view of any observers. His presence serves the same function as allowing a child to hold a comfort object or have a support person present, both of which are standard practice in cases involving child witnesses. Judge nodded. The court agrees with the prosecution's assessment. Mister, I understand your concerns about preserving your client's right to a fair proceeding, and I assure you that every precaution will be taken. The dog will not interact with the jury should this proceed to trial. The dog will not be introduced as evidence. The dog serves solely as an emotional support tool to help a traumatized child feel safe enough to testify. Is there any legal precedent you can cite that would prohibit this court from making such an accommodation? Shuffled through his notes desperately, his confidence visibly deflating. Your Honor, I would need to research the specific case law in Colorado. While you're researching, mister, I can save you some time. Judge opened the folder and began reading. People v. Masters, Colorado Court of Appeals, 2018. Quote, the use of a certified facility dog to comfort a child witness during testimony does not violate a defendant's confrontation rights under the Sixth Amendment, provided the dog's presence does not impede the defendant's ability to cross-examine the witness. End quote. Would you like me to continue? I have 6 more relevant cases here, including 2 from the Colorado Supreme Court. The courtroom had fallen absolutely silent. Several of the observing judges in the gallery were nodding appreciatively at Judge's thorough preparation. His face had gone from red to pale, and he slowly sank back into his chair. Your Honor, he said quietly, the defense maintains its objection, but acknowledges the court's authority to make this ruling. Thank you, Mr. Judge turned to, where is Officer Mitchell? As if on cue, the side door to the courtroom opened, and Officer Sarah Mitchell stepped inside. She was in her late 30s, with kind eyes and an air of calm competence that seemed to radiate from her very presence. She wore her police uniform with pride, and attached to her belt was a specialized leash connected to a therapy dog vest that read Courthouse Facility Dog Do Not Pet. But every eye in the courtroom immediately moved, past Officer Mitchell to the magnificent animal at her side. Duke was a 3-year-old golden retriever whose coat seemed to glow like spun gold under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. He was larger than average for his breed, probably weighing close to 80 pounds, but every ounce of him radiated gentle strength and calm wisdom. His dark brown eyes surveyed the room with remarkable intelligence, and his tail swayed gently in a slow, peaceful rhythm that seemed to lower the blood pressure of everyone who looked at him. The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and palpable. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped or whispered appreciatively. Diana Torres, who had been crying silently through the entire legal argument, looked up and felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time all morning. Even, who had been objecting strenuously just moments before, couldn't suppress a slight softening of his expression as he looked at the beautiful dog. But the most dramatic change was in Emma. The little girl who had been dozing fitfully against her mother's shoulder suddenly lifted her head. Her red-rimmed blue eyes locked onto Duke with laser focus. Her grip on Mr. loosened for the first time in hours. Her mouth, which had been pressed into a tight, traumatized line, opened slightly in wonder. "Puppy," Emma whispered, so quietly that only her mother heard her at first, but then louder, with the first hint of life returning to her small voice. "Mommy, puppy." Diana Torres felt tears spring to her eyes again, but these were different tears. These were tears of hope. She looked up at Judge with an expression of such profound gratitude that the judge had to swallow hard against the lump forming in her own throat. Judge watched as Officer Mitchell guided Duke slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom, allowing the dog to move at his own measured pace. Duke's training was evident in every step. His gait was smooth and unhurried, his head remained level, and his attention stayed focused on Officer Mitchell despite the many distractions around him. When they reached the front of the courtroom, Officer Mitchell positioned Duke beside the witness stand and gave a subtle hand signal. Duke immediately sat, his posture perfect, his tail still swaying gently. His eyes, warm and infinitely patient, looked toward Emma with an expression that seemed almost human in its understanding and compassion. For the first time since entering the courtroom that morning, Emma Torres smiled. It was a tiny smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. And in that moment, Judge knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right decision. Whatever legal challenges might come from this unusual accommodation, whatever appeals might file, whatever criticism she might face from more conservative colleagues, none of it mattered compared to the sight of that small, traumatized child beginning to emerge from her shell of terror. "Let the record reflect," Judge said softly, "that Officer Sarah Mitchell and courthouse facility Dog Duke have entered the courtroom and taken position near the witness stand. We will now take a brief recess to allow the child witness to become accustomed to Duke's presence before we resume testimony." As the courtroom began to stir, Emma Torres slipped from her mother's arms and took one small, hesitant step toward the golden dog, who had just walked into her nightmare and offered her a way out. The afternoon sun had shifted position, casting long rectangular shadows across the polished floor of courtroom 4D, as Judge resumed the session at 2:15 p.m. The lunch recess had been extended by 30 minutes to give Emma Torres time to gradually acclimate to Duke's presence in a less formal setting. During that time, in a small conference room down the hall, something remarkable had begun to unfold. Officer Sarah Mitchell had worked with traumatized children and therapy dogs for nearly 8 years, and she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read both the child and the canine, orchestrating introductions with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. She had watched as Emma, initially hovering near her mother's legs, had inched closer and closer to where Duke lay calmly on the floor, his head resting on his massive paws, his eyes half closed in a picture of complete non-threatening serenity. The first touch had come after 12 minutes. Emma's small index finger, extended as far as her arm could reach while she remained safely behind her mother, had barely grazed Duke's soft ear. The dog's only response had been to open his eyes fully and gaze at Emma with an expression of such gentle acceptance that Diana Torres had broken down crying all over again. Within 20 minutes, Emma had been sitting cross-legged on the floor, stroking Duke's golden fur with both hands while whispering secrets that only the therapy dog could hear. Now, as everyone filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. There was still tension. This was still a court proceeding that could determine whether a violent man would face justice. But threaded through that tension was something new, a fragile ribbon of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this traumatized child might finally be able to speak her truth. Judge had used the lunch break to field no fewer than 7 phone calls from other judges in the building who had heard about what was happening in her courtroom. 3 had called to offer support and share their own experiences with courthouse facility dogs. 2 had called with concerns about setting precedent. 2 more had called simply because they wanted to witness history being made and asked if they could observe from the gallery. Judge had politely declined the last requests. The courtroom was already crowded enough, and Emma needed as few strange faces as possible. "All rise," announced, and the courtroom came to order once again. Emma stood beside her mother in the front row, and this time when she looked at the witness stand, she didn't pale or tremble. Her eyes immediately sought out Duke, who lay in his designated position beside the chair, his therapy dog vest clearly visible, his tail beginning its gentle metronome sway the moment he saw Emma looking at him. "We'll resume testimony," Judge announced, her voice deliberately calm and measured. "Emma, sweetheart, would you like to come up and sit in the chair again? Duke is going to stay right there beside you the whole time." For a moment, Emma hesitated, her hand tightening around her mother's. Diana Torres knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with her daughter, and whispered something that no one else could hear. Emma nodded solemnly, clutched Mister against her chest with one arm, and began the long walk from the gallery to the witness stand. Every person in that courtroom held their breath as they watched the tiny girl navigate the distance that must have seemed like miles to her small legs. Her pink sneakers, which had dangled helplessly from the witness chair that morning, now carried her forward with tentative but determined steps. She passed the defense table where her father sat, had positioned Robert Torres' chair so that he wasn't directly in Emma's line of sight, a small mercy that Judge acknowledged with a brief nod. When Emma reached the witness stand, she paused. The chair still loomed large and intimidating above her. Dr. Lisa Hammond, who had resumed her position in the child-height chair beside the stand, offered Emma an encouraging smile but didn't speak. She had learned from the morning's failed attempts that too much encouragement could sometimes increase a child's anxiety rather than reduce it. Then Duke did something that his training had prepared him for but which still caught everyone by surprise. The golden retriever rose smoothly to his feet, took 2 careful steps forward, and positioned himself directly between Emma and the witness chair. He sat again, his shoulder now just inches from Emma's small body, creating a living, breathing barrier between the frightened child and all the overwhelming adult authority of the courtroom. Officer Sarah Mitchell, standing quietly at the side of the room, felt her heart swell with pride. This was exactly what Duke's training had prepared him for, to read a situation, assess what the traumatized individual needed, and provide it without being asked. She had seen him do variations of this maneuver dozens of times, but it never failed to amaze her how intuitive and perfectly timed his responses were. Emma's hand, almost of its own accord, reached out and tangled itself in the thick fur at Duke's neck. The dog remained perfectly still, allowing the child to use him as an anchor, a lifeline to something warm and safe in a world that had recently taught her that people couldn't always be trusted, but that perhaps, just perhaps, this golden creature could be. With Duke's presence giving her courage, Emma climbed into the witness chair. Her feet still didn't touch the floor, but somehow she seemed less dwarfed by it than she had that morning. She settled Mister in her lap and then, without anyone suggesting it, she looked down at Duke and patted her leg in a universal gesture that needed no translation. Duke glanced at Officer Mitchell, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. The therapy dog rose, moved closer to the witness chair, and carefully positioned himself so that Emma could reach down and touch him while still remaining seated. Then he laid down in that exact position, his head now resting on his paws but angled so that Emma could see his face, his eyes open and alert, conveying a silent message that seemed to say, "I'm here. You're safe. You can do this." Judge felt tears threatening again and blinked them back firmly. She had presided over thousands of testimonies, heard countless witnesses, and maintained her judicial composure through descriptions of horrors that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But there was something about this moment, this small child finding courage through the presence of a gentle dog, that struck straight through all her professional armor and touched the grandmother's heart that beat beneath her judge's robes. "Emma," Dr. Hammond began softly, her voice like honey and warmth, "that's a very nice rabbit you have. Does he have a name?" Emma's eyes remained fixed on Duke as she nodded slowly. Her lips moved, forming words, but no sound came out at first. She tried again, and this time a whisper emerged. "Mister." It wasn't much, 2 words, barely audible even in the silent courtroom. But it was speech. It was communication. It was the first crack in the wall of traumatic silence that had held Emma prisoner all morning. "Mister is a wonderful name," Dr. Hammond continued, maintaining the same gentle, unhurried tone. "How long have you had Mister?" Emma's hand reached down and stroked Duke's head, her fingers moving through his silky fur with a rhythmic motion that seemed to calm her. "Long time," she whispered. "Mommy gave him when I was baby." Dr. Lisa Hammond felt professional satisfaction wash over her. They were making progress, real, measurable progress. Emma was speaking, responding to questions, engaging with the world again instead of retreating into traumatized silence. And all of it was possible because of the calm, non-judgmental presence of the therapy dog lying beside the witness stand. Michael, watching from the prosecution table, felt the knots in his stomach begin to loosen slightly. They weren't out of the woods yet. The difficult questions about the night of the assault still lay ahead, but at least Emma was talking. That was more than they'd achieved all morning. To his credit, remained silent during these preliminary exchanges. He could have objected, could have complained that the questioning was leading, or that the child's as a witness was still unestablished. But even he seemed to recognize that some moments transcended legal maneuvering, that some things were more important than winning a case. Or perhaps he simply recognized that objecting now would make him look heartless and might prejudice Judge even further against his client. Either way, he stayed quiet, his pen moving across his legal pad in quick, frustrated strokes. Robert Torres, however, couldn't maintain the same restraint. He leaned toward his attorney and hissed something that was clearly meant to be whispered but carried in the silent courtroom. "This is ridiculous. That dog has no business." "Mr. Torres," Judge's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and commanding, "you will remain silent or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Your attorney speaks for you. Do you understand?" Robert Torres' face flushed an ugly red, his hands clenching into fists on the table. For a moment, Judge thought he might explode, might say something that would reveal the violent temper that had put his wife in the hospital, but placed a restraining hand on his client's arm and leaned in to whisper urgently in his ear. Whatever he said worked. Robert Torres settled back in his chair, though his jaw remained clenched and his eyes burned with barely suppressed rage. Emma had tensed at the sound of her father's voice, her hand freezing mid-stroke on Duke's head. The little girl's breathing had quickened, and her eyes had gone wide with that familiar look of panic that threatened to shut her down completely. But then Duke, with the impeccable timing that made him an exceptional therapy dog, lifted his head and gently nudged Emma's hand with his nose. The gesture was subtle but clear. "I'm still here. Keep petting me. Focus on me, not on him." Emma's attention snapped back to Duke, and she resumed stroking his fur, her breathing gradually slowing back to normal. The crisis had passed, barely, but it had passed. Dr. Hammond waited a full minute before continuing, allowing Emma to fully herself. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried extra warmth, extra reassurance. "Emma, you're doing so well. Duke really likes you, can you tell? His tail is wagging." Emma looked down and saw that Duke's tail was indeed swaying gently back and forth, sweeping the floor in slow arcs. A tiny smile ghosted across her face, the second smile Judge had seen from the child that day, and this one was even more precious than the first. "He's happy," Emma whispered, and then with more confidence, "He's a good doggy." "He is a very good dog," Dr. Hammond agreed. "And you're being very brave, Emma. Your mommy is very proud of you." Emma's eyes flickered toward the gallery where Diana Torres sat, clutching a tissue in her good hand, tears streaming down her face. Mother and daughter locked eyes for a moment, and some wordless communication passed between them. Love, encouragement, strength. Then Emma nodded, took a deep breath that seemed far too large for her small chest, and said something that made every adult in the courtroom sit up. "I can talk now. Duke makes me not scared." Judge had to press her lips together firmly to maintain her composure. In that simple, childish sentence was everything that this extraordinary intervention had been designed to achieve. Emma wasn't declaring herself completely healed. Trauma didn't work that way. But she was saying that Duke's presence had created enough emotional safety for her to lower her defenses, to risk being vulnerable, to trust that she could speak her truth without being destroyed by it. Officer Sarah Mitchell, standing quietly at the side of the room, felt a wave of profound gratitude for the animal she had spent years training. Duke would never know the full impact of what he did in courtrooms like this one. He would never understand that his gentle presence helped deliver justice, protected the innocent, and gave voice to the voiceless. He simply did what he had been trained to do: offer unconditional acceptance and support to people who needed it most. Dr. Hammond glanced at Judge, who gave a subtle nod. It was time to move forward, to gently guide Emma toward the difficult testimony that this entire proceeding hinged upon. But they would do it carefully, with patience, and with the golden guardian lying beside the witness stand, ready to catch Emma if she faltered. "Emma," Dr. Hammond said softly, "can you tell me about the night that Mommy got hurt?" The courtroom held its breath once more. Emma's hand paused in Duke's fur, and for a heartbeat, Judge thought they might lose her again, that the wall of traumatic silence might slam back into place. But then Emma looked down at Duke, met his calm, accepting gaze, and began to speak. Retrieve the moment hung suspended in time, fragile as spun glass. Emma Torres sat in the oversized witness chair, her small hand buried in Duke's golden fur, her blue eyes locked on the therapy dog's warm brown gaze. Dr. Lisa Hammond had just asked the question that everything hinged upon. "Can you tell me about the night that Mommy got hurt?" For 3 heartbeats, Emma said nothing. Her chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. Her fingers tightened in Duke's coat. Judge felt her own heart hammering against her ribs, and she realized she was gripping the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles had turned white. In 17 years on the bench, she had never felt so emotionally invested in a single moment of testimony. Then, without warning or permission, Emma did something that no one expected. She slid down from the witness chair. It wasn't a panicked flight or a retreat into silence. It was a deliberate, purposeful movement. Emma's pink sneakers touched the floor with soft thumps, and she moved directly to where Duke lay beside the witness stand. Dr. Hammond started to speak, to gently redirect the child back to the chair, but Officer Sarah Mitchell caught her eye and gave the slightest shake of her head. "Wait. Watch. Let this happen." Emma dropped to the floor with the boneless ease that only small children possess, folding her legs beneath her until she sat cross-legged directly beside Duke. She set Mr. carefully in her lap, as if the stuffed rabbit also needed to be part of this moment. Then, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their deliberateness, Emma wrapped both arms around Duke's neck and buried her face in his fur. The therapy dog's response was immediate and perfect. Duke shifted his position slightly, adjusting his body so that Emma could lean against him more comfortably. He turned his head, his large muzzle gently touching the top of Emma's curls, and then he simply held that position, solid, warm, present. His breathing remained slow and deep, and Emma's frantic respirations gradually began to synchronize with his, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the dog's calm, steady breaths. Officer Mitchell felt tears prick her eyes. In all her years working with Duke, she had seen him provide comfort to dozens of traumatized witnesses, but there was something especially profound about watching this tiny child instinctively seek out exactly what she needed from the therapy dog. Duke had been trained for thousands of hours to provide this kind of support, but in moments like this, Mitchell believed his gift went beyond training. It was something innate, something almost spiritual in its purity. Judge looked at Dr. Hammond, a silent question in her eyes. Should we intervene? Stop this? Maintain the formality of the proceeding? But Dr. Hammond's expression was one of wonder mixed with professional fascination. The child psychologist had spent 2 decades working with traumatized children, and she recognized what she was witnessing. Emma was regulating her nervous system, using Duke's calm presence to literally calm her own body's stress response. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. Let her be, Dr. Hammond mouthed silently to the judge. The courtroom remained absolutely still. No one coughed, no one shifted in their seats, no one dared break the spell of this extraordinary moment. Even the defense attorney who had objected so strenuously to Duke's presence sat frozen with his pen hovering over his legal pad, seemingly mesmerized by what he was witnessing. Diana Torres in the gallery had both hands pressed over her mouth, trying to contain the sobs that threatened to escape. She had watched her daughter retreat into traumatized silence over the past 3 weeks, had held Emma through nightmares and panic attacks, had felt utterly helpless in the face of her child's pain. But now, seeing Emma voluntarily seek comfort and finding it in Duke's gentle presence, Diana felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the night of the assault: hope. After what felt like an eternity but was actually only 90 seconds, Emma's breathing had completely steadied. Her death grip on Duke's fur had loosened into something gentler, more rhythmic, a continuous petting motion that seemed to comfort both the child and the dog. And then, with her face still partially buried in Duke's golden coat, Emma began to speak. "Daddy was yelling," she whispered, her voice muffled by fur but audible in the silent courtroom. "Really, really loud yelling. It scared me. It scared Mr. too." Dr. Hammond, who had moved her own chair closer to where Emma sat on the floor, responded in the same gentle, unhurried tone she had been using all day. "That sounds very frightening, Emma. Where were you when Daddy was yelling?" "In my room, in my bed. It was nighttime, dark outside." Emma's hands continued their rhythmic motion through Duke's fur, and the dog remained perfectly still, allowing himself to be both anchor and comfort. "But I heard the yelling, so I got up. I wanted Mommy." "That was very brave of you," Dr. Hammond said softly. "What happened when you got up?" Emma pulled back slightly from Duke, just enough to look at his face. The therapy dog met her gaze with those impossibly kind brown eyes, and something passed between them, an unspoken communication that seemed to give Emma the strength to continue. "I went to the stairs, the big stairs." Emma's voice was stronger now, though still quiet. "I sat on the top step with Mr. I could see down into the kitchen. That's where Mommy and Daddy were." Michael, at the prosecution table, was taking careful notes while simultaneously trying not to make any movements that might distract Emma from her testimony. This was it. This was the eyewitness account they desperately needed. But he also knew they had to let it unfold at Emma's pace, guided by Dr. Hammond's expertise and supported by Duke's presence. "What did you see in the kitchen, Emma?" Dr. Hammond asked, her voice still gentle but carrying a note of careful focus. This was the crucial moment, the testimony that would either make or break the case. Emma's hand stilled in Duke's fur for a moment. Her breathing quickened slightly, and Judge saw the child's shoulders begin to tense. They were approaching the traumatic core of the memory, the part that had locked Emma in silence all morning. This was where everything could still fall apart. But then Duke, with the intuitive brilliance that made him an exceptional therapy dog, did something remarkable. He shifted his weight slightly and lowered his head until his chin rested on Emma's knee. The gesture was so gentle, so perfectly timed, that it seemed almost choreographed, but Officer Mitchell knew it wasn't. This was Duke reading Emma's escalating stress and responding with exactly the right amount of additional physical contact to help her feel grounded and safe. Emma looked down at the golden head resting on her knee, and her hand resumed its stroking motion, now petting Duke's soft ears. The physical contact with the dog seemed to create a circuit of calm, allowing Emma to access the traumatic memories without being overwhelmed by them. "Daddy was pushing Mommy," Emma said, her voice taking on a flat, dissociative quality that Dr. Hammond recognized as a child's way of protecting herself from the full emotional impact of what she was describing. "He pushed her really hard. Mommy fell down. She hit her head on the corner of the counter where Mommy makes my sandwiches." The specificity of that last detail, "where Mommy makes my sandwiches," hit everyone in the courtroom like a physical blow. It was such a childlike observation, grounding a moment of violence in the everyday reality of a little girl's life. The place where sandwiches were made, where normal, loving parent-child interactions happened, had been transformed into the site of brutal assault. Diana Torres let out a choked sob from the gallery. She remembered regaining consciousness in the hospital, her head wrapped in bandages from the 12 stitches required to close the laceration from the granite counter edge. She had asked immediately about Emma, terrified that Robert might have hurt their daughter too. The police had assured her that Emma was physically unharmed, but Diana had known immediately that her daughter had been hurt in ways that wouldn't show up on a medical examination. "What happened after Mommy fell down?" Dr. Hammond asked, though she already knew the answer from the police reports and hospital records. The testimony needed to come from Emma in Emma's own words for it to have legal weight. Emma's voice remained in that same flat, protective monotone, but her hands moved continuously through Duke's fur, as if the motion itself was keeping her tethered to the present moment rather than lost in the traumatic past. "Mommy was on the floor. She wasn't moving. There was red stuff, blood. I know about blood because I fell off my bike and had blood on my knee once." Again, that heartbreaking childhood logic, trying to make sense of adult violence through the lens of a skinned knee from a bike accident. Judge found herself blinking rapidly, fighting to maintain her judicial composure. "Daddy was standing over Mommy," Emma continued. "He was still yelling bad words, the words I'm not supposed to say. Then he kicked Mommy in her arm. I heard a crack sound like when I break my crayons." The flat affect in Emma's voice couldn't completely mask the horror of what she was describing. Robert Torres had dislocated Diana's shoulder with that kick. The medical records had confirmed it. The crack sound Emma had heard was likely the sound of the joint separating, an injury that had required surgical repair. Sat completely motionless at the defense table, his face pale. He had read the medical reports, had seen the photographs of Diana Torres' injuries, but hearing them described through the eyes of a 3-year-old witness brought home the brutality of his client's actions in a way that clinical documentation never could. Robert Torres, beside him, had his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles jumped visibly, his hands balled into fists on the table. "What did you do then, Emma?" Dr. Hammond asked gently. "I wanted to help Mommy, but I was scared. Mister said to stay quiet, stay on the stairs, so I did. I stayed very, very quiet." Emma's voice cracked slightly on those last words, and she pressed her face back into Duke's fur for a moment, seeking comfort. Duke responded by shifting again, this time moving his whole body closer to Emma, creating a protective barrier between the child and the rest of the courtroom. His tail, which had maintained its gentle, rhythmic wagging throughout Emma's testimony, increased its tempo slightly, not in excitement, but in what Officer Mitchell recognized as Duke's way of providing additional reassurance to someone in distress. After a moment, Emma pulled back again, and when she spoke, her voice was stronger, more present. "Then Daddy saw me, on the stairs. He looked at me and his eyes were scary, really scary, like a monster. He yelled at me to go back to bed and he said the bad F word." Judge made a note on her pad. That detail, Robert Torres seeing his daughter witnessing his violence would be important for establishing his state of mind and consciousness of guilt. I ran back to my room really fast and closed the door. I put Mr. under my covers and I hid too. I heard more yelling and then it got quiet. Then I heard Daddy's car start, the loud sound his car makes. Then nothing. Dr. Hammond nodded encouragingly. You did exactly the right thing, Emma. You kept yourself safe. What happened next? I waited a really long time. I don't know how long, forever long. Then I opened my door really quiet and went back to the stairs. Mommy was still on the floor. She wasn't moving. I thought. Emma's voice finally broke, the flat affect crumbling as the 3-year-old's fear came flooding back. I thought Mommy was dead like the goldfish we buried in the garden. The courtroom collectively held its breath as Emma began to cry, not the silent, frozen tears of trauma, but the genuine, cathartic sobs of a child releasing pent-up terror. And through it all, Duke remained pressed against her, solid and warm and infinitely patient, absorbing her pain without judgment or expectation. Dr. Hammond let Emma cry for several moments before gently asking, "But Mommy wasn't dead, was she?" Emma shook her head against Duke's fur. "No," she made a sound, a hurt sound, so I went down the stairs even though I was scared Daddy would come back. I got the phone, the big phone, not Mommy's cell phone because I don't know how that one works. I pushed 911 like Mommy taught me for emergencies. The lady on the phone was nice. She told me to stay with Mommy and that helpers were coming. Michael felt a surge of admiration for Diana Torres. Despite everything she had been through that night, she had done what every parent should do. She had taught her daughter how to call for help in an emergency. That teaching had likely saved Diana's life. The EMT's report had stated that if Diana had gone much longer without medical attention, she might have bled out from her head injury. Judge looked at the small child on the floor, wrapped around a golden therapy dog, having just recounted one of the most traumatic experiences any child could witness, and felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of justice. This wasn't just about legal precedent or courtroom procedures. This was about giving voice to the voiceless, about creating space for truth to emerge even from the depths of trauma. And it was about recognizing that sometimes justice required more than laws and evidence. Sometimes it required compassion, creativity, and a golden retriever named Duke who understood the language of broken hearts better than any human ever could. The silence that followed Emma's testimony hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and profound. 3-year-old Emma Torres remained on the floor, her small body curled against Duke's larger frame, her fingers still moving through his golden fur in that continuous, soothing rhythm that seemed to keep her anchored to the present moment. Tears had left tracks down her flushed cheeks, but her breathing had steadied, and there was something different in her posture now, something lighter, as if speaking the unspeakable had released a weight she had been carrying alone for far too long. Dr. Lisa Hammond sat quietly in her child-sized chair, giving Emma the space and time she needed to recover from the emotional toll of recounting that terrible night. The child psychologist had seen this moment countless times in her career, the moment after a traumatized child finally releases their burden of terrible knowledge. It was always sacred, always profound, and it always required patience and reverence rather than rushing forward to the next question. Judge used the pause to survey her courtroom. Diana Torres sat in the front row of the gallery, openly weeping now, but there was something transformative in her tears. These weren't the helpless, desperate tears of a mother watching her child suffer in silence. These were tears of release, of gratitude, of witnessing her daughter reclaim her voice and her power. Diana's good hand was pressed over her heart, and her lips moved in what might have been prayer or simply wordless thanks to the universe for the golden dog who had made this miracle possible. Michael had stopped taking notes. His pen lay forgotten on his legal pad, and he sat with his hands clasped together, his expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and deep personal emotion. He had prosecuted domestic violence cases for 12 years, had seen the devastating impact of intimate partner violence on families, had fought to hold perpetrators accountable. But he had never witnessed anything quite like this. A child finding her voice through the presence of a therapy dog, transforming what could have been a re-traumatizing legal proceeding into something that might actually contribute to healing rather than additional harm. Even the defense attorney seemed affected by what he had witnessed. His earlier objections and legal maneuvering felt hollow now, almost shameful in the face of Emma's raw, honest testimony. He avoided looking at his client, Robert Torres, whose face had progressed from red anger to pale realization as he heard his daughter describe his violence in simple, devastating detail. Knew that his chances of winning this case had just evaporated. No judge or jury who heard Emma's testimony would doubt what had happened that night. Officer Sarah Mitchell stood at her position near the side wall, watching Duke work with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed his gift many times before but never took it for granted. She could read every subtle shift in the therapy dog's body language, the way he had adjusted his position multiple times during Emma's testimony to provide exactly the right amount of physical support, the way his breathing remained deliberately slow and deep to help regulate Emma's own nervous system, the way his eyes stayed soft and accepting even when Emma had sobbed into his fur. Duke was doing what he had been trained to do, but Mitchell knew it was more than training. Some dogs had this gift, this ability to sense exactly what a traumatized person needed and provide it without hesitation or judgment. After what might have been 2 minutes or might have been 10, time had become elastic in the emotional intensity of the moment. Emma lifted her head from Duke's fur and looked directly at Dr. Hammond. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, but there was a clarity in them that hadn't been there before. "The doggy loves me," Emma said quietly, and it wasn't a question but a statement of absolute certainty. Dr. Hammond smiled, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Duke cares about you very much, Emma. He's here to help you feel safe so you can tell the truth about what happened. And you have been so incredibly brave today. You've told us exactly what you saw, and that was very, very hard to do." Emma nodded solemnly, as if acknowledging the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. Mister was scared, but Duke made him feel better too. She held up her stuffed rabbit, and in that moment, Judge understood that Emma was talking about herself, projecting her own fears and healing onto her beloved toy in the way that children often do. "I'm glad Duke could help both you and Mr. Dr. Hammond replied gently. "Emma, I need to ask you a few more questions and then we'll be all done for today. Is that okay?" Emma looked down at Duke, as if seeking the therapy dog's permission or approval. Duke's tail swayed steadily back and forth, and he tilted his head slightly, that universal dog expression that seemed to say, "You've got this. I'm right here with you." "Okay," Emma agreed, "but I want to stay down here with Duke, not in the big chair. The big chair is too far away from him." Judge leaned forward, her voice warm and authoritative. "Emma, you can absolutely stay right where you are with Duke. You've been very brave today, and whatever makes you feel most comfortable is what we'll do." Started to rise from his chair, presumably to object to this highly irregular testimony position, but something made him stop. Perhaps it was the warning look in Judge's eyes. Perhaps it was the recognition that objecting now would make him look monstrous. Or perhaps it was simply the understanding that he had already lost this case, and anything he did now would only make things worse for his client on appeal. Whatever the reason, he slowly settled back into his chair without saying a word. Dr. Hammond pulled her own chair even closer to where Emma sat on the floor with Duke. "Emma, after you called 911, what happened next?" "The lady on the phone said helpers were coming. She said to stay with Mommy and talk to her. So I sat next to Mommy on the floor, not too close because there was blood and I didn't want to step in it, and I told Mommy about my day at preschool, about how we painted pictures and how I made a friend named Sophie who has a kitty cat." The image of a 3-year-old child sitting beside her unconscious, bleeding mother chattering about preschool and paintings and new friends, trying to comfort someone who couldn't hear her. It was almost unbearable in its poignancy. Several people in the gallery were crying openly now, and even Judge had to pause to collect herself. "That was very kind of you to talk to your mommy," Dr. Hammond said, her voice thick with emotion. "What happened when the helpers arrived?" There were lots of people in uniforms with a big red truck. They had a special bed on wheels for mommy. One nice lady with brown hair, she wore blue clothes. She came to me and said I was very brave and very smart to call for help. She gave me a teddy bear sticker. Emma touched her chest, where the sticker had presumably been placed weeks ago. Then they took mommy away in the loud truck with the flashy lights. A police lady stayed with me. She was nice too. She made me hot chocolate while we waited for Grandma to come get me. Michael made a note to identify and commend the first responders who had handled Emma with such care and compassion. Their kindness in that moment of crisis had probably helped prevent even deeper trauma. "Emma, this is a very important question," Dr. Hammond said carefully, her voice taking on a slightly different tone, one that conveyed to everyone in the courtroom that they were approaching a crucial legal element. "The man who hurt your mommy, can you see that man here in this room right now?" The courtroom seemed to stop breathing collectively. This was the identification testimony, the moment when Emma would need to point out her father as the perpetrator. It was one of the most legally significant moments of the entire proceeding, and everyone knew it. Emma's hand tightened in Duke's fur, and her breathing quickened slightly. Officer Mitchell saw it immediately and gave a subtle hand signal. Duke shifted his position, pressing more firmly against Emma's side, providing additional physical support for what he somehow understood was a difficult moment. Emma's eyes traveled slowly around the courtroom. They passed over the court reporter, over the clerk, over the people in the gallery. When her gaze reached the defense table, she stopped. Her whole body tensed, and for a moment Judge thought Emma might shut down again, that the fear of identifying her father might prove too overwhelming even with Duke's support. But then Emma looked down at Duke, and the therapy dog looked back at her with those infinitely patient, infinitely kind brown eyes. Some wordless communication passed between the girl and the dog, a transfer of courage, a reminder that she was safe, that she had already done the hardest part and this was just one more step. Emma raised her small arm and pointed directly at Robert Torres. "That's Daddy," she said, her voice clear and steady and absolutely certain. "That's the man who hurt Mommy." Robert Torres' face contorted with rage. He started to rise from his chair, his hands slamming on the table. "She's been coached," he shouted, his voice carrying the same angry violence that Emma had described from the night of the assault. "That bitch put her up to this. She's lying. She's just a stupid kid who doesn't know what." "Bailiff," Judge, voice cracked like a gunshot. Two court security officers were already moving toward the defense table before she finished speaking. "Remove Mr. Torres from this courtroom immediately. Mister, your client has just demonstrated for all of us exactly the kind of violent temper that put his wife in the hospital. I'm revoking his bail, and he will remain in custody pending trial." The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos as the bailiffs approached Robert Torres, who continued to shout obscenities and threats, sat with his head in his hands, knowing that his client had just sealed his own fate more effectively than any testimony could have. Diana Torres had instinctively moved toward the front of the courtroom, as if to protect her daughter, but Emma remained on the floor with Duke, seemingly untouched by her father's outburst. Because Duke, magnificent Duke, had immediately positioned himself between Emma and the source of the shouting. The therapy dog's body blocked Emma's view of her raging father being led away by bailiffs. His presence created a physical and emotional barrier that transformed what could have been a re-traumatizing moment into just background noise that had nothing to do with Emma's safe space on the floor with her golden protector. As Robert Torres was forcibly escorted from the courtroom, still shouting, Emma looked up at Judge with wide eyes. "Is Daddy going away now?" she asked in a small voice. Judge came down from her bench. A highly unusual move, but these were unusual circumstances. She approached Emma carefully, kneeling down to the child's level with more grace than her 62-year-old knees usually allowed. "Yes, sweetheart," Judge said gently. "Your daddy is going away for a very long time. He won't be able to hurt your mommy anymore, and he won't be able to scare you anymore. You are safe now, and your mommy is safe now, and that's because you were so brave today. You told the truth, even though it was scary, and that's one of the most important things anyone can do." Emma considered this for a moment, her hand still resting on Duke's head. Then she said something that would stay with Judge for the rest of her life. "Duke helped me be brave. Without Duke, the scared was too big, but Duke made the scared smaller so I could use my words." Out of the mouths of babes, Judge thought. This 3-year-old child had just articulated better than any legal scholar could the fundamental purpose of courthouse facility dogs, not to manipulate proceedings or prejudice outcomes, but simply to make the scared small enough that truth could emerge. "Yes," Judge said, her voice rough with emotion. "Duke helped you be brave, and now, because you were brave, your mommy can heal and you can heal and justice can be done. You are a remarkable little girl, Emma Torres." Emma smiled then, a real, genuine smile that transformed her tear-stained face and reminded everyone in the courtroom that despite everything she had witnessed and endured, she was still just a 3-year-old child who deserved to laugh and play and grow up without fear. "Can Duke come visit me sometimes?" Emma asked hopefully. "I like him very much." Officer Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, smiling through her own tears. "We'll have to see what we can arrange, Emma. Duke has to work with other children who need his help too, but I'm sure he'd love to visit you sometime." Emma nodded, accepting this with the philosophical grace of childhood. Then she threw her arms around Duke's neck one more time and whispered something into his fur that only the therapy dog could hear. Duke's tail wagged harder, and if dogs could smile, Judge would have sworn that Duke was beaming with pride at the brave little girl who had found her voice in his presence. As Diana Torres was finally allowed to come forward and embrace her daughter, as Emma was officially released from testimony, as the courtroom began to return to some semblance of normal procedure, Judge stood watching the scene and felt the trajectory of her life shift beneath her feet. This case, this child, this dog, they had shown her something profound about the intersection of justice and healing, about the importance of innovation and compassion in a system that could sometimes feel cold and bureaucratic. Emma had found her voice today, but Judge had found her calling to ensure that every traumatized child in Colorado's court system had access to the same kind of support that had transformed Emma's testimony from impossible to achievable. The work was just beginning, but as Judge watched Emma giggle as Duke gently licked her hand, she knew with absolute certainty that this was work worth doing, no matter how many obstacles lay ahead. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through courtroom 4D as Judge officially adjourned the proceedings at 4:47 p.m. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the now emptying courtroom. Emma Torres had been reunited with her mother and grandmother, whisked away to begin the long journey of healing that lay ahead. The gallery had cleared, the court reporter had packed up her equipment, and the bailiffs had escorted a still-shouting Robert Torres to the county jail where he would await trial. A trial that, given his outburst and his daughter's testimony, would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence. But Judge remained seated at the bench, unmoving, staring at the spot where Emma had sat on the floor with Duke just minutes before. The weight of what she had witnessed pressed against her chest like a physical force, making it difficult to draw a full breath. In 17 years of presiding over family court, she had seen countless children testify about abuse, neglect, and trauma. She had heard stories that haunted her dreams and challenged her faith in humanity. But she had never, not once, witnessed such a clear, undeniable demonstration of how the justice system could be transformed by a single, seemingly simple intervention. Her clerk appeared in the doorway to chambers carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea. Had worked with Judge long enough to recognize the signs of her boss processing something profound. She set 1 cup on the bench without a word and retreated, understanding that Judge needed space to think. But Judge didn't want space. She wanted action. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand how something as straightforward as a trained therapy dog could have been missing from her courtroom for 17 years while she struggled to help traumatized children find their voices through conventional means alone. With sudden decisiveness, Judge stood, grabbed her tea, and strode into her chambers. She went directly to her computer and began typing with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. Her first search: Courthouse Facility Dogs United States Statistics. The results flooded her screen, and with each article, each research paper, each case study she clicked on, Judge felt a mixture of excitement and frustration building in her chest. The data was overwhelming and unequivocal. Children who with courthouse facility dogs showed measurably lower cortisol levels, the stress hormone, than those who without canine support. They provided more detailed, coherent testimony. They showed fewer signs of re-traumatization. The recidivism rate for having to testify multiple times decreased dramatically because the initial testimony was more complete and legally sound. Judge learned that the first courthouse facility dog, a golden retriever named, had been placed in King County, Seattle in 2003, over 20 years ago. Since then, the movement had grown steadily but inconsistently across the United States. Some jurisdictions had robust programs with multiple dogs serving their courts. Others, like Colorado, had barely scratched the surface of what was possible. She pulled up Colorado's current statistics and felt her frustration deepen into anger, not at any individual but at the system itself. The entire Denver metro area, serving a population of nearly 3 million people, had only 3 courthouse facility dogs. 3. For all the family courts, all the criminal courts, all the traumatized witnesses, children and adults alike, who might benefit from this intervention, there were only 3 dogs available. Judge began making calculations in her head. Based on the data she was reading, approximately 2,000 children in Colorado courts each year in cases involving abuse, domestic violence, or other traumatic circumstances. If even half of those children could benefit from a facility dog's presence, and the research suggested the percentage was actually much higher, that meant roughly 1,000 children per year were testifying without support that could significantly reduce their trauma and improve the quality of their testimony. 1,000 children, 1,000 Emmas, struggling to find their voices in a system that, despite everyone's best intentions, was inherently intimidating and potentially re-traumatizing. The knock on her door was tentative. Judge looked up to find Officer Sarah Mitchell standing in the doorway, Duke sitting calmly at her side, his therapy dog vest still in place, his tail swaying gently. "Your Honor, I wanted to thank you before we left," Officer Mitchell said. "What you did today, allowing Duke to work with Emma, it's going to change things. I know it will." Judge stood and walked around her desk, surprising both Officer Mitchell and herself by pulling the younger woman into a brief, fierce hug. "No, Officer Mitchell, what Duke did today is going to change things. I just had the good sense to let him do his job." She stepped back, her professional composure reasserting itself, but her eyes remained warm. "How long have you been advocating for expanded funding for the facility dog program?" Officer Mitchell's expression turned rueful. 3 years, Your Honor. I've written grant proposals, attended city council meetings, spoken at community events. We've managed to add 1 dog in that time. 1. The funding just isn't there, and without awareness of what these dogs can do, it's hard to make the case for prioritizing the program. Judge felt something crystallize inside her chest, a sense of purpose so clear and compelling that it felt almost like destiny. "That," she said firmly, "is about to change. Officer Mitchell, I need you to send me every piece of data, research, and documentation you have on courthouse facility dogs. Efficacy studies, cost-benefit analyses, training protocols, success stories, everything. Can you do that?" Officer Mitchell's eyes widened. "Of course, Your Honor, I have files upon files. I'll email them to you tonight. May I ask what you're planning?" Judge's smile was sharp and determined, the expression that had earned her the nickname the Dragon and made unprepared attorneys tremble. "I'm planning to make courthouse facility dogs a standard resource in every Colorado courthouse that needs one. I'm planning to tell Emma's story, with proper anonymity protections, of course, to every legislator, every legal organization, every potential donor, and every journalist who will listen. I'm planning to turn this into a movement." Officer Mitchell felt tears spring to her eyes. "Your Honor, that would be incredible. Do you know what it's like to work with these dogs every day, to see the difference they make, and to know that we can only help a tiny fraction of the people who need us? It's heartbreaking." "I saw what Duke did today," Judge said quietly. "I saw a child who was completely shut down by trauma find her voice again. I saw justice made possible by compassion. And I realized that in 17 years on this bench, I've been operating with one hand tied behind my back, trying to serve traumatized witnesses without giving them access to one of the most effective interventions we have available." She shook her head. "That ends now. I don't care how many meetings I have to attend, how many speeches I have to give, or how many grant proposals I have to write. This program is going to expand, and it's going to expand significantly." Duke, who had been sitting patiently throughout this exchange, chose that moment to walk over to Judge and sit directly in front of her. He looked up at her with those warm brown eyes, and his tail wagged steadily back and forth. Judge found herself kneeling down, for the second time that day, her knees protesting, and placing both hands on either side of Duke's golden face. "You're a very good boy," she told him seriously. "You're not just a good boy, you're a hero. You gave Emma her voice back today. Do you understand that?" Duke's tail wagged harder, and he leaned forward to lick Judge's hand with gentle affection. The judge laughed, a sound of pure joy that surprised her with its intensity. "I'm going to make sure there are 100 more dogs just like you working in Colorado's courts. That's a promise." Officer Mitchell watched this interaction with a full heart. She had advocated for the facility dog program for years, often feeling like she was shouting into a void, fighting an uphill battle against budget constraints and bureaucratic inertia. But here was Judge, one of the most respected and influential judges in Colorado's court system, kneeling on her chamber floor, making promises to a therapy dog, and by extension, to all the traumatized witnesses who needed what that dog could provide. After Officer Mitchell and Duke departed, Judge returned to her computer with renewed energy. She began drafting an email to every judge she knew in Colorado's judicial system, describing what she had witnessed that day and making an impassioned case for expanding courthouse facility dog programs. She wrote with the kind of fierce eloquence that came from bearing witness to something that had fundamentally changed her understanding of her profession. "Today I watched a 3-year-old victim find the courage to testify about her mother's brutal assault," she typed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Not because of my legal expertise, not because of our child psychologist's training, but because of a golden retriever named Duke who understood something fundamental that we in the legal profession sometimes forget. Before justice can be served, people must feel safe enough to speak their truth. We have the power to provide that safety. We have the research. We have the successful models. What we lack is the collective will and resources to make this standard practice rather than rare exception. I am writing to ask each of you to join me in changing that." She spent the next 2 hours writing similar letters to the Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court, to the state's Attorney General, to the directors of victim advocacy organizations, and to journalists she knew who covered legal affairs. Each letter was personalized. Each one told Emma's story, with identifying details carefully changed, and each one ended with a clear call to action. By the time knocked on her door at 7:30 p.m. to remind her that she had promised her husband she'd be home for dinner, Judge had sent 17 emails, drafted 3 op-ed pieces for legal publications, and begun outlining a presentation for the Colorado Judicial Conference scheduled for the following month. "You're going to burn yourself out," said gently, using her boss's first name, something she only did when they were alone and she was genuinely concerned. "Whatever you're working on, it can wait until tomorrow." Judge looked up from her computer and was startled by the intensity in her eyes. "No, it can't wait. There's a traumatized child testifying somewhere in Colorado right now, struggling to find their voice, and they don't have access to what could help them. Every day we wait is another day that a child suffers unnecessarily, that justice is delayed, or that we fail to live up to our responsibility to serve the most vulnerable people in our system." Had worked with Judge for over a decade, and she had never heard such passionate conviction in her boss's voice. Whatever had happened in that courtroom today, it had fundamentally transformed the Judge she thought she knew so well. "What happened today?" asked softly. "I mean, I know about the testimony and the therapy dog, but what really happened to you?" Judge was quiet for a long moment, staring at her computer screen without really seeing it. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and slightly wondering, as if she was discovering her own thoughts as she articulated them. "I think I remembered why I became a judge in the first place," she said slowly. "Not to manage dockets or interpret statutes or write legal opinions, though those things are important. I became a judge because I believed the legal system could be a force for healing and protection, not just punishment and procedure. And today, I saw what that actually looks like in practice. I saw a child who was drowning in trauma get thrown a lifeline, and I realized that I have the power and the responsibility to make sure every child in my jurisdiction has access to that same lifeline." She turned to look at directly. "I've been a good judge, I know that. I've been fair, thorough, prepared. But today I realized that being a good judge isn't enough. I want to be the judge who changed the system, who made it more humane, who left it better than I found it. And this," she gestured at her computer screen filled with emails and documents, "this is how I'm going to do it." Smiled, her own eyes glistening with emotion. "Then I'll help you. Tomorrow we'll start making calls, scheduling meetings, whatever you need. But tonight, you're going home to have dinner with your husband and get some rest. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint, and you're going to need your energy." Judge nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her clerk's words. She saved her documents, shut down her computer, and gathered her things. But as she walked out of the courthouse into the cool Denver evening, she felt lighter than she had in years, as if she had been carrying a weight she hadn't even been aware of and had suddenly put it down. The work ahead would be challenging. She would face budget objections, bureaucratic resistance, skepticism from traditionalist colleagues. But Judge had spent 17 years building credibility, relationships, and expertise. She had been preparing for this moment without even knowing it, and now that the moment had arrived, she was ready. As she drove home through the darkening streets of Denver, Judge thought about Emma Torres, hopefully sleeping peacefully in her bed for the first time in weeks, her trauma finally spoken aloud and witnessed. She thought about Duke, that magnificent golden dog who understood something profound about healing and justice. And she thought about all the other children who would come after Emma, who would face their own moments of terror in courtrooms across Colorado. They would not face those moments alone. If Judge had anything to say about it, and she most certainly did, they would all have their own Duke, their own golden guardian to help them find their voices and speak their truths. The transformation had begun. Days later, Robert Torres stood before Judge for sentencing, his hands shackled, his expensive suit replaced by an Orange County Jail jumpsuit, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. The trial had been mercifully brief. Emma's testimony, combined with overwhelming physical evidence and medical records, had left the jury with no reasonable doubt. They had deliberated for just 90 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: aggravated assault, domestic violence, child endangerment. had done his professional duty, mounting what defense he could, but his heart clearly hadn't been in it. After witnessing Emma's testimony and his client's courtroom outburst, had privately advised Robert Torres to accept a plea deal. Torres had refused, arrogantly certain that no jury would convict him based on a little kid's made-up stories. He had been catastrophically wrong. Now, as judge prepared to deliver her sentence, the courtroom was packed. Diana Torres sat in the front row, her arm finally free of its sling, her bruises completely healed. Emma was not present. Judge had made certain the child would not have to face her father again, but Emma's impact on the proceedings was felt by everyone in the room. "Mr. Torres," Judge began, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of brutal crimes against your wife, committed in the presence of your 3-year-old daughter. The evidence presented at trial painted a picture of a man who believes violence is an acceptable response to frustration, a man who showed no remorse even when confronted with the terror he inflicted on his own child." Robert Torres' jaw clenched, but he remained silent. His attorney had warned him that any outburst during sentencing would only make things worse. "The law provides sentencing guidelines," Judge continued, "but it also grants this court discretion to consider aggravating factors, and there are many aggravating factors in this case. You committed this assault in the presence of a young child. You demonstrated a pattern of escalating violence. You showed no remorse. And perhaps most significantly, your actions in this courtroom, threatening your victim and traumatizing your daughter with your violent outburst, demonstrated that you remain a danger to your family and society." Judge paused, looking down at the sentencing documents before her, though she had already made her decision hours ago. "Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 15 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, with no possibility of parole for a minimum of 10 years. Additionally, upon your release, you will be subject to a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with the victims in this case. You will be required to complete anger management and domestic violence intervention programs while incarcerated. Do you understand this sentence?" "This is bullshit," Torres exploded, surging forward against the bailiffs who immediately restrained him. "That bitch poisoned my own daughter against me. This whole thing is a—" "Remove him," Judge ordered sharply, and the bailiffs with professional efficiency, dragging Torres from the courtroom as he continued to shout obscenities and threats. Diana Torres watched him go, and for the first time since the assault, she allowed herself to feel genuinely safe. 15 years. Emma would be 18 when he was released, an adult who could make her own decisions about whether to have any contact with him. By then, the little girl who had trembled in silence would be a young woman with her own voice, her own strength, her own life ahead of her. After the sentencing concluded, after Diana Torres had thanked Judge with tears streaming down her face, after the courtroom had finally cleared, Judge returned to her chambers to find her desk covered with responses to the emails she had sent 3 days earlier. The replies were overwhelming in both volume and enthusiasm. 14 judges had responded within the first 24 hours, many sharing their own frustrations about working with traumatized child witnesses without adequate resources. The Chief Justice had written a particularly thoughtful response, expressing strong support for expanding courthouse facility dog programs and offering to discuss the initiative at the next meeting of the State Judicial Council. 3 victim advocacy organizations had reached out offering partnerships and resources. And most surprisingly, 2 journalists from major Colorado newspapers had already written articles about Emma's case, using the carefully anonymized version Judge had provided, that had gone viral across the state's social media. But it was the email from the Colorado Bar Association that made Judge's heart race with possibility. They wanted her to give the keynote address at their annual conference in 6 weeks, speaking specifically about trauma-informed courtroom practices and the use of facility dogs. The conference typically drew over 500 attorneys, judges, and legal professionals from across the state. It was exactly the platform Judge needed to turn her individual passion into a statewide movement. She immediately called into her chambers. "Clear my calendar for the next month as much as possible," Judge instructed, her eyes bright with determined energy. "I need time to prepare this presentation, meet with stakeholders, and build a coalition. This is going to be big, bigger than one courtroom, one judge, one case. This is going to change how Colorado's entire justice system works with traumatized witnesses." Smiled, recognizing the unstoppable force her boss had become. "I'll make it happen, but you should know, you've already changed things more than you realize. I've been getting calls from court clerks across the state asking about Duke, about Officer Mitchell, about how they can start similar programs in their jurisdictions. Emma's story is spreading." Judge felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with urgency. The momentum was building, but momentum alone wasn't enough. They needed funding, training programs, protocols, partnerships with therapy dog organizations, buy-in from law enforcement and court administrators. The list of tasks ahead was daunting, but Judge had never been afraid of hard work. Over the next month, Judge became a woman possessed. She met with the Denver Police K-9 unit leadership to understand the full scope of their current program and its limitations. She learned that training a single courthouse facility dog cost approximately $25,000 and took nearly 2 years from puppy selection through full certification. The dogs needed specific temperaments: calm, focused, intuitive, able to handle stress without becoming reactive. Not every dog could do this work, which made each certified facility dog precious and rare. She met with nonprofit organizations that specialized in training service and therapy dogs, exploring partnerships that could create a pipeline of courthouse-ready animals. She met with county commissioners and state legislators, making the case for increased funding with the kind of data-driven arguments that appealed to fiscally conservative decision-makers. She emphasized that facility dogs reduced the need for multiple court appearances, reduced witness trauma that could lead to expensive mental health interventions, and improved conviction rates in cases involving vulnerable witnesses, all of which translated to cost savings in the long run. She met with trauma psychologists and child development experts, absorbing their research and incorporating it into her growing presentation. She learned about theory and how Duke's calm presence had literally helped regulate Emma's nervous system. She learned about the neurobiology of trauma and how feeling safe was a prerequisite for accessing traumatic memories and articulating them coherently. The science behind what she had witnessed in her courtroom was robust and compelling, and Judge became fluent in explaining it to diverse audiences. She also met with Officer Sarah Mitchell repeatedly, forming a partnership that would prove crucial to the movement's success. Mitchell had the practical knowledge and experience. Judge had the platform and credibility. Together, they developed a comprehensive proposal for expanding Colorado's courthouse facility dog program from 3 dogs to 20 within 2 years, with a long-term goal of having at least 1 certified facility dog available in every Colorado county. The financial ask was substantial, $500,000 for the initial expansion, plus ongoing operational costs. But Judge's research had uncovered multiple potential funding sources: state appropriations, federal victim assistance grants, private foundation support, and individual donors. She began crafting grant proposals and funding appeals with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to legal opinions. 6 weeks after Emma's testimony, Judge stood at the podium of the Colorado Convention Center's Grand Ballroom, looking out at over 600 legal professionals who had come to hear her speak. The room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. Word had spread about the case, about Emma and Duke, about the judge who was trying to transform how Colorado's courts served traumatized witnesses. Judge had spent weeks preparing her presentation, but now, standing before this sea of faces, she decided to set aside her carefully crafted notes. Instead, She was going to tell them a story, Emma's story, and trust that the truth of it would be more persuasive than any polished speech. 6 weeks ago, Judge began, her voice carrying clearly through the large space, a 3-year-old girl walked into my courtroom to testify about the worst night of her young life. She was terrified, traumatized, completely unable to speak, and for 2 hours, despite our best efforts, despite having an excellent child psychologist, a compassionate prosecutor, and all the traditional courtroom accommodations we typically provide, this little girl could not find her voice. She sat in that witness chair, drowning in her trauma, and we were failing her. The room was completely silent, every eye fixed on Judge. Then something remarkable happened, Judge continued. A golden retriever named Duke walked into my courtroom, and within minutes, that terrified, silent child began to speak. Not because the dog was a magic cure for trauma. He wasn't. But because Duke provided something that all our legal expertise and good intentions couldn't. He made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable to remember to speak her truth. For the next 45 minutes, Judge held her audience spellbound. She described Emma's testimony in detail, the way the child had slid from the witness chair to sit with Duke, the way her breathing had synchronized with the dog's calm respiration, the way Duke had positioned himself as a barrier between Emma and her raging father. She shared the research on facility dogs, the neuroscience of trauma, the legal precedents supporting their use. She presented the cost-benefit analysis, the success rates, the testimony quality improvements. But most importantly, she spoke from her heart about what it meant to be a judge, to hold the responsibility of serving justice while protecting the vulnerable. She talked about her 17 years on the bench, about all the children she had watched struggle to testify, about her growing realization that compassion and innovation weren't luxuries in the justice system. They were necessities. "We have the knowledge," Judge declared, her voice rising with passion. "We have the research. We have successful models from other states. We have dogs like Duke and handlers like Officer Mitchell ready to serve. What we need is the collective will to make this standard practice rather than rare exception. What we need is funding, infrastructure, and commitment from every level of our justice system." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, victim advocates, court administrators. "I'm asking each of you to join me in building a justice system that recognizes that before we can demand truth, we must first provide safety. I'm asking you to support the expansion of courthouse facility dog programs across Colorado. I'm asking you to donate, to advocate, to volunteer, to spread the word. And I'm asking you to remember that little girl who found her voice, because someone gave her a golden guardian to help her feel brave." When Judge finished speaking, the room erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, the standing ovation continuing for nearly 3 minutes. But more importantly, as Judge would discover in the days and weeks that followed, they did more than applaud. They acted. Donations began pouring in within hours of her speech. $5,000 from a large law firm, $500 from a retired judge, $25 here and $100 there from individual attorneys who had been moved by Emma's story. A wealthy philanthropist whose own daughter had been a victim of abuse wrote a check for $150,000. $3 major foundations expressed interest in funding multi-year grants. The state legislature began discussing a line item in the next budget, specifically for courthouse facility dogs. Within 3 months of Emma's testimony, Judge's pause in the courtroom initiative had raised over $400,000 and secured commitments for another $300,000 in foundation grants and state funding. Officer Mitchell was promoted to oversee the expanded program, tasked with recruiting and training both new dogs and new handlers. The movement had begun, and at its heart was the memory of a 3-year-old girl and a golden dog who had shown everyone what justice infused with compassion could look like. 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days after Emma Torres had first walked into courtroom 4D, Judge stood in the soaring atrium of the Denver courthouse, surrounded by a crowd of over 200 people gathered for a ceremony that felt more like a celebration than a formal dedication. The November morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the polished marble floor where 15 magnificent dogs sat in perfect formation with their handlers, their therapy vests gleaming, their tails wagging in synchronized rhythm that seemed almost choreographed. Judge, now 64 years old, felt tears threatening for what must have been the 100th time that morning. She had become something of a national figure in the past 2 years, featured in legal journals, interviewed on morning news programs, invited to speak at conferences across the country. Her pause in the courtroom initiative had exceeded even her most optimistic projections. What had started as a desperate attempt to help one traumatized child had blossomed into a statewide program that was now being replicated in 17 other states. Colorado's courthouse facility dog program had grown from 3 dogs to 23. 15 of those dogs and their handlers were present today for the official dedication ceremony. The other 8 were in courtrooms across the state, doing the sacred work of helping traumatized witnesses find their voices. In the 2 years since the program's expansion, over 340 children and vulnerable adults had been assisted by facility dogs during their testimony. The statistics were staggering. A 73% reduction in the need for multiple court appearances, an 81% improvement in testimony coherence ratings, and perhaps most significantly, a 64% decrease in reported PTSD symptoms among child witnesses who had worked with facility dogs compared to those who hadn't. But statistics, impressive as they were, couldn't capture what Judge had witnessed over and over again in her courtroom. The moment when a frozen, traumatized person made eye contact with a gentle dog and felt safe enough to begin healing. She had seen it in a 7-year-old boy testifying about his father's abuse, in a teenage girl describing her assault, in an elderly woman with dementia trying to recall details of financial exploitation. Each time, the presence of a trained facility dog had transformed an ordeal into something more bearable, had turned re-traumatization into resilience. Touch Judge elbow gently. "They're ready for you, Your Honor, and we have a surprise guest who just arrived." Judge turned toward the entrance and felt her breath catch. Diana Torres stood there, elegant in a navy dress, her arm fully healed, her bruises long faded to distant memory. But it was the little girl holding her hand who made Judge's vision blur with tears. Emma Torres was now 5 years old, no longer the terrified toddler who had clutched Mister in frozen silence. She had grown tall for her age, her curls now cut into a stylish bob, her blue eyes bright with confidence rather than terror. She wore a yellow dress covered in, Judge smiled through her tears, images of golden retrievers. Emma's other hand clutched not Mister, though Judge suspected the beloved rabbit was still treasured at home, but a carefully prepared bouquet of flowers. But the most remarkable transformation was in Emma's demeanor. She walked with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who felt safe in the world, who knew she was loved and protected, who had spoken her truth and been believed. The trauma hadn't disappeared, trauma never completely disappeared, but it no longer defined her. Emma Torres was thriving, enrolled in kindergarten, excelling in school, making friends, living the life every child deserved. As Diana and Emma approached, the crowd parted respectfully. Judge descended from the small platform that had been erected for the ceremony and knelt down, her knees no longer protesting quite as much after 2 years of this gesture, to meet Emma at eye level. "Hi, Judge," Emma said with the careful pronunciation of a child who had practiced these words. "Mommy said you're the one who brought Duke to help me. Thank you for that. Duke was my friend when I was really scared." Judge had to swallow hard before she could speak. "You are very welcome, Emma, and thank you for being so brave. Because you found your courage to tell the truth, you helped not just yourself and your mommy, but hundreds of other children who came after you." Emma considered this with the seriousness of childhood wisdom. Duke helped me be brave. Before Duke, the scared was too big, but Duke made the scared small enough. She repeated the words she had spoken 2 years ago, words that Judge had quoted in countless speeches and presentations. Yes, he did, Judge agreed. And now there are many more dogs like Duke helping many more children feel brave. Would you like to meet some of them? Emma's face lit up with pure joy. Really, there are more dogs like Duke. Officer Sarah Mitchell, now the director of Colorado's Courthouse Facility Dog Program, stepped forward with a warm smile. She had been promoted 18 months earlier, and her expanded team now included 12 handlers and 23 dogs serving courts across Colorado. She had personally overseen the training of 8 new facility dogs and had become a national expert in her field, consulting with programs in other states. Emma, there are lots of dogs like Duke now, Officer Mitchell said. Would you like to meet them? They've all heard about you. You're kind of famous in the facility dog world. Emma giggled, a sound of such pure, uncomplicated happiness that several people in the crowd found themselves crying. Judge watched as Officer Mitchell led Emma toward the formation of 15 facility dogs, golden retrievers, Labrador retrievers, and one exceptionally gentle German shepherd, all trained to provide the same kind of compassionate support that Duke had offered Emma 2 years ago. But one dog in particular caught Emma's attention. At the end of the formation sat Duke himself, now 5 years old but still magnificent, his golden coat perhaps showing a few silver hairs around his muzzle, his brown eyes as warm and knowing as ever. He was officially retired from active duty now. 5 years was a full career for a facility dog, and Duke had earned his retirement, but Officer Mitchell had asked him to attend this special ceremony. "Duke," Emma cried out, and with her mother's permission, she ran toward the retired therapy dog who had changed her life. Duke's tail began wagging with increasing intensity, and when Emma reached him, he remained in his sitting position but leaned forward to gently lick her face as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "I missed you so much," Emma whispered into Duke's fur. "I think about you all the time. Mommy got me a dog. His name is Sunny and he's little and not as good at being calm as you, but I love him. But you're still my special friend who helped me when I needed help the most." There wasn't a dry eye in the courthouse atrium. Cameras flashed. News crews from local and national outlets had come to cover the ceremony, and Judge knew that the image of Emma reuniting with Duke would be in newspapers and on television screens across the country by evening. But more than the publicity, more than the awareness it would raise, Judge was simply grateful to witness this moment of pure connection between a child who had been saved and the dog who had helped save her. After several minutes, Emma reluctantly released Duke and returned to her mother's side. Judge returned to the platform, composed herself with visible effort, and began the formal dedication ceremony. 2 years ago, Judge said, her voice carrying clearly through the large space, this courthouse was the site of a miracle. Not a miracle in the religious sense, but a miracle of human and canine compassion and innovation. A terrified child found her voice with the help of a remarkable therapy dog, and in doing so, she set in motion a transformation of how Colorado's justice system serves its most vulnerable witnesses. Judge gestured to the 15 dogs and their handlers. Today, we gather to dedicate this expanded courthouse facility dog program and to honor not just the dogs and handlers who serve, but the brave witnesses, especially the children, who have shown us why this work is so essential. We gather to celebrate what happens when the justice system embraces innovation, when we recognize that compassion and legal rigor are not opposed but complementary. She pulled back a curtain to reveal a bronze plaque mounted on the courthouse wall. The plaque featured a relief sculpture of a child sitting with a dog, and beneath it, an inscription. Pause in the courtroom, Colorado Courthouse Facility Dog Program. Dedicated November 15, 2027. Where justice meets compassion. In honor of all the brave witnesses who have found their voices, and the noble dogs who have helped them speak their truth. The crowd erupted in applause. Officer Mitchell and her team of handlers stood with their dogs, all maintaining perfect position despite the noise and activity, a testament to the hundreds of hours of training each animal had received. Emma clapped enthusiastically, jumping up and down with excitement. But Judge wasn't finished. I want to share some numbers that tell the story of what we've accomplished together. In the past 2 years, Colorado's expanded facility dog program has assisted 347 traumatized witnesses, including 289 children. We've seen measurable improvements in testimony quality, significant reductions in witness trauma, and higher conviction rates in cases involving crimes against vulnerable victims. We've reduced court costs through fewer continuances and repeated testimony requirements. And perhaps most importantly, we've helped hundreds of people like Emma, navigate the justice system without being re-traumatized by the process itself. Judge's voice grew more passionate. But we're not done. This program is now being replicated in 17 states, with another 12 in the planning stages. The model we've built here in Colorado, combining rigorous dog training, handler expertise, trauma-informed legal protocols, and sustainable funding, is becoming a national standard. We've shown that it's possible to transform a justice system, to make it more humane without sacrificing its integrity, to serve both justice and healing. She paused, her eyes finding Emma in the crowd. And it all started because one little girl needed help, and we had the wisdom to provide it in an unconventional way. Emma, would you please come up here? Diana Torres gave her daughter an encouraging nod, and Emma walked confidently to the platform. Judge handed her a special certificate that had been prepared for the occasion. Emma Torres, Judge said formally but warmly, on behalf of the Colorado judicial system and the courthouse facility dog program, I present you with this certificate of courage in recognition of your bravery in finding your voice and speaking your truth. Because of your courage, hundreds of other children have been helped. You started something bigger than any of us imagined possible. Emma accepted the certificate with both hands, studying it seriously. Then she looked up at Judge and said something that would be quoted in articles and speeches for years to come. I wasn't brave by myself. Duke was brave with me. And now other kids don't have to be brave by themselves either. They can have dog friends to be brave with them. Out of the mouths of babes, Judge thought for the second time in her relationship with Emma. This 5-year-old child had just articulated the fundamental principle of the entire program more eloquently than any legal scholar could. The ceremony concluded with refreshments and a meet and greet where attendees could interact with the facility dogs and their handlers. Judge watched as Emma moved from dog to dog, greeting each one with the kind of reverence usually reserved for heroes, which, Judge reflected, they were. Later that afternoon, after the crowds had dispersed and the news crews had packed up their equipment, Judge sat in her chambers with Officer Mitchell, Diana Torres, and Emma. Duke lay on the floor between them, his head resting on Emma's lap as the little girl stroked his graying muzzle with the gentle touch of someone who understood exactly how precious this dog was. "What's next?" Diana asked. "You've built this incredible program in Colorado. What's your next goal?" Judge smiled. "Federal legislation. I've been working with several members of Congress on a bill that would provide funding for courthouse facility dog programs in all 50 states. It's called the Courthouse Therapy Access and Response Act, the CARE Act. We're hoping to introduce it next session." Officer Mitchell's eyes widened. "Your Honor, that's ambitious. That's incredible." "Emma taught me to be ambitious," Judge replied, looking at the child who had transformed her understanding of justice. "She taught me that sometimes the impossible is just the necessary that we haven't yet found the courage to attempt. If a 3-year-old can find the courage to face her worst nightmares, I can certainly find the courage to navigate congressional politics." Emma looked up from petting Duke. "Will there be dogs in every courthouse, so no kids have to be scared alone?" "That's the goal, sweetheart," Judge confirmed. Dogs in every courthouse that needs them, helping every child who needs help. It might take a few years, but we're going to make it happen. Emma nodded solemnly, then smiled. Duke would like that. He'd want all the scared kids to have dog friends. Judge looked at Duke, that magnificent golden retriever who had walked into her courtroom 2 years ago and changed everything. The dog's eyes were closed now, his breathing deep and peaceful as Emma petted him, his tail swaying gently even in his rest. Yes, Judge said softly, Duke would want that very much. And because of Duke and because of you, Emma, that's exactly what we're going to build. A justice system where no child has to face their fears alone, where compassion and courage walk hand in hand, where healing is as important as accountability. As the afternoon sun streamed through her chamber windows, Judge felt a profound sense of peace and purpose. She had been a judge for 19 years now, had presided over thousands of cases, had made countless decisions that affected people's lives. But nothing in her career would ever be as important or as transformative as the day she had allowed a golden therapy dog into her courtroom and watched a miracle unfold. The work would continue. There would be more children to help, more programs to build, more barriers to overcome. But today, in this moment, Judge allowed herself to simply sit with the profound gratitude she felt. Gratitude for Emma's courage, for Duke's gift, for Officer Mitchell's dedication, for Diana Torr's strength, and for the opportunity to have been part of something that truly mattered. Justice, Judge had learned, wasn't just about laws and verdicts. It was about creating space for truth to emerge, for healing to begin, for the vulnerable to find their voices. And sometimes, justice wore a golden coat, had 4 paws, and answered to the name Duke. Epilogue. 5 years later, the CARE Act passed both houses of Congress and was signed into law, providing federal funding for courthouse facility dog programs in all 50 states. By that time, over 500 certified facility dogs were serving in courtrooms across America, and the number continued to grow. Emma Torres, now 10 years old, wrote a children's book called Duke, My Brave Friend, about her experience, with proceeds going to train more facility dogs. Judge, who retired at 70 and became a full-time advocate for trauma-informed justice practices, wrote the foreword. Duke lived to the remarkable age of 14, spending his retirement as a reading therapy dog at Emma's elementary school, where he helped anxious children feel brave enough to read aloud. When he passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the people who loved him, his memorial service was attended by over 300 people whose lives he had touched. Officer Sarah Mitchell went on to establish the National Courthouse Facility Dog Training Institute, setting standards for programs across the country. And in courtrooms across America, traumatized witnesses continue to find their voices with the help of gentle dogs who understand something profound about courage, compassion, and the healing power of unconditional love. Emma Torres had been right all along. Duke made the scared small enough to be brave, and because of him, thousands of other scared people found their courage too. That was Duke's legacy, that was love's legacy, and that was justice at its very best. The end.